was raised a Mormon in small town Utah, where he moved to New York City. When he moved to New York City for college, the clash of cultures filled his mind with so many questions that it ended up becoming a religion professor in the process of answering them. He has a PhD in the Sociology of Religion from Rutgers University, and he has taught at the University of North Florida since 2000. He is the current president of the Mormon Social Science Association. I'm glad to know there is such a thing. We're a small group, so we can be fairly informal. Welcome,
Yeah.
Rick Phillips.
Thank you for having me. Let me just tell you a little bit about myself, a little about what I want to accomplish tonight. I was asked to speak on the subject of Mormonism. That's good because it's probably the only thing I know anything about. And so what I'm going to do is give you an overview of the history and theology of Mormonism and give everybody plenty of opportunities to ask questions. As we go along, you can just, I have the chat window open here. And so as you go along, you can submit questions or comments or requests for clarification in real time as we're moving forward, and I can address those as I'm going. So you don't have to wait for the end with your questions. I should be able to fold some of your insights and questions into the presentation. I had some stuff prepared that I was going to use, but it was on my laptop, and I have a long-range antenna on my desktop computer, and so I'm using that because our internet is out in the house, which is a perfect day for the internet to go out in your house. So right now I am using the hotspot on my phone. There should be plenty of bandwidth. My children are currently being tortured because I told them no YouTube until this is over. So hopefully we will be able to get through it. Let me start off by telling you a little bit about myself, because my biography is actually integral to the presentation. I was raised in Logan, Utah, in the Cache Valley, which is one of the most Mormon places on earth. Even today, Cache Valley is near 90% Mormon. When I was a little kid, there was no, in our elementary school, every single kid was LDS, as we call Latter-day Saints, a Mormon. And so with respect to my upbringing, Mormonism was axiomatic. It was something that I was raised with. It was like, the anthropologist Ralph Linton once said, the last thing on earth a fish would ever notice would be water. And what he meant by that is that sometimes our social conditions are so ingrained that we don't even notice them. Well, Mormonism was the water that I swam in. And so that was my life. And I was an extremely religious kid. I was a very devout believer. I was a very strict behavior. And I was interested in being a religious professional. I wanted to be, Mormonism has a lay clergy, but they have a church education system. And I wanted to be a teacher, a religious educator in this church education system. And that required fairly devout adherence to Mormon cultural norms. So for instance, one of the things that you often see around town are guys on bicycles in white shirts and ties. Have you all seen them riding around on their bikes? I did that. Every Mormon boy does that or is supposed to do that. At the time I did it, you had to be 19 years old. Now it's 18 years old. And there was never any doubt that I was going to do it because it was just something you did when you turned 19. So I went on a mission, rode around on my bike, and the idea was that I was going to come home and start a career as a religious educator. And one of the ways that I thought I would be a good religious educator is to make sure that I understood all of the learning and the knowledge of the wicked world. Because if you want to have good arguments, you should be able to refute the arguments of the unwashed secularists and people who have no Holy Ghost in their life. So I went to college with that in mind. And one of the most important things that I thought I should do is to learn to read the Bible in its original languages. So I wanted to study Hebrew and Greek so that I would be able to defend the Word of God against any and all foes. And so it was at college that I encountered modern biblical scholarship. And that sort of transformed the way I looked at my faith. It transformed the way that I looked at the world. Because what happened is I saw problems with Scripture. I saw things in the original languages that didn't show up in English. I just had an encounter with secular learning, and I realized, wow, these people are not as dumb as I thought. And so slowly but surely, it began to erode my faith. So what happens when you are a young man and you have invested your entire life in a career, and then the rug is pulled out from underneath you? And so I thought, well, I'm not going to be a religious educator, so I'll just be a religion professor. So I switched from sort of the idea of a priestly role to an academic role, and I got interested in the academic study of religion. And that's how I ended up at Rutgers. It was a great school. It was a great experience. And I studied Mormonism at Rutgers. There were a number of issues. At that time, there were a number of theoretical issues in the sociology of religion that were sort of vexing problems that scholars were working on. And I used Mormonism to try and answer these debates and answer these questions, because I had insider access, which is something that most people don't have. And so that's how I ended up being a college professor. I have worked as a college professor at the University of North Florida here in Jacksonville for my entire career. And that's how I ended up doing what I do, studying Mormonism, which is a great way to sort of, I always tell people I do the sociology of me, or I think about my career as one long therapy session where I try to figure out what's happened to me by studying my life. It's a great way to go. So what I wanted to do is go over the history of Mormonism, because the interesting thing about Mormonism is it's the religion that you encounter all the time or you hear about all the time that you don't know much about. People really don't know the ins and outs of Mormonism. They know it's some sort of Christian religion, and Mitt Romney is a Mormon, and the Osmonds, but there's a lot more to it than that. So what I want to do is go over the history and theology of Mormonism, then I'll leave plenty of time for your questions. So one interesting thing about Mormonism is that it's an American original. It was a religion founded in the United States, and it was founded in the United States at a particular time. The church was founded in 1830, and right after the Revolutionary War, when the nation was young, there was a lot of social ferment. The nation was shifting to a market economy. There was great population growth. There was a lot of mobility. People were moving into frontier areas for fresh land to cultivate. And so a lot of the old hierarchies and a lot of the old social structures that had maintained order in society were collapsing. And nowhere was this more true than in the Finger Lakes region of upstate New York, near where Rochester and Syracuse is today. And this was a frontier region in the 1820s, and there's lots of agriculture going on there, but also the Erie Canal was being built. And the Erie Canal at its time was a huge public works project, and what it was going to allow was for goods to come down the St. Lawrence River to the Great Lakes, and then across New York State into the Hudson River and down to New York City. So it was a massive public works project, and all kinds of speculators were rushing to make money on the building of the Erie Canal, and the area around the Finger Lakes region began to explode. And what all of that population growth did was it sort of overthrew existing hierarchies, including religious hierarchies, and established clergy started to lose their prestige. And parish boundary, their itinerant preachers that would go around and have camp meetings began to strip away at the parish system that existed that provided order. And these itinerant preachers had the gall to sort of preach the word without having gone to seminary. So they were sort of unlettered and unwashed, but they were still preaching. So you have an incredible amount of religious cacophony and religious confusion that's going on in this region. And it was so there was such religious ferment that historians have called this the burned over district. I don't know if you've taken American history, you may have heard of something called the Second Great Awakening or the Great Awakening. This is this period of religious ferment. And living in the middle of this was a young farm boy by the name of Joseph Smith. And he was a religious kid. He was concerned about his immortal soul, and he wanted to know which church was true. Now, his own account of what happened was that one day he went into the woods to pray, and he was deeply confused about which church he should join, and he figured what he would do was ask God which church he should join. And so he knelt down to pray to ask God which church he should join, and the answer to that prayer was a vision. And what happened was he was visited by God the Father and Jesus Christ in bodily form in a vision, and those deities told him that he shouldn't join any church. And the reason he shouldn't join any church is because they're all wrong, and that they are corrupt in God's sights, and that their ministers are all deceived, and that in due time he would restore the true religion. He would restore the religion that Jesus taught. So that was what Mormons called Joseph Smith's first vision. Years passed, and the interesting thing about the first vision is there's a lot of debate about historians whether the first vision sort of precedes the events that I'm going to tell you now, or whether the first vision was sort of a post hoc invention that came later. The first vision story certainly evolved a lot over the course of its retelling. In the original telling, in Joseph Smith's own hands, he asked for forgiveness of his sins, but certainly the idea of a restored church became essential to the Mormon story. So one of the things that Joseph Smith used to do was he engaged in a form of folk magic called money digging. And this was the idea that you could use something like a divining rod or something like they called them seer stones. And they were stones that you would put in a hat, or stones that you could look into that would allow you to see buried treasure in the earth. And Joseph Smith hired himself out as one of these money diggers. And so he sort of made a living looking for buried treasure in the earth. And I think that's interesting context for what comes next, because what comes next is Joseph Smith said that later in the 1820s, he started receiving visitations at night from an angel who identified himself as Moroni. And this angel told Joseph Smith that buried in a hill not far from his house was an ancient record that was written on gold plates. You can see the sort of the connection between the idea of being a treasure seeker and digging for buried treasure and this idea of gold plates in the ground. And so in time, Joseph Smith was sent to retrieve these plates, and these plates had a record of the ancient inhabitants of the New World, and that is the record that we know as the Book of Mormon. So ordinarily, I would say everybody got that, everybody hear about that, but since I can't see most of you, I'm just going to assume that everybody is with me so far. Now, the Book of Mormon is interesting because it was an attempt to answer a burning theological question of its day. And so when the Book of Mormon now is used for completely different purposes for what it was used when it was originally written. So I told you that it was the idea that it was a record of the ancient inhabitants of the New World before European settlement. And that solved the vexing theological problem of the day. And here is the problem, the theological problem that the nation's leading religious scholars were grappling with. Okay, so Adam and Eve, according to the book of Genesis, are the first humans, and all of humanity are descended from Adam and Eve. And Adam and Eve obviously happened in the old world. So that's premise number one. Premise number two, look at the incredibly advanced European society. Obviously, we're the most advanced people on Earth. We're the ones with, we're the ones with sailing ships. We're the ones that can navigate the ocean. So Adam and Eve took place on the old world. European society is the apex of civilization. And yet, when our European ships reached the New World, there were already people here. So we got a problem. Either those people managed to get here before we got here, and therefore they're more technologically advanced than we are, or there has to be some sort of two Adams and two Eves, because how would they have gotten here? You see the dilemma? The dilemma is, who are the Native Americans and how did they get here? Because if they use technology to get here, then they're better than us. That's unacceptable. And if they didn't use technology to get here, then there are humans that aren't descended from Adam and Eve. That seems unbiblical. So Joseph Smith solved this problem by saying that a family of Israelites that lived in the Levant in 600 BC, just before the Babylonian captivity, were led by God across the ocean. And this family, the family of the prophet Lehi, were the original inhabitants. There's some more to it, but I mean, essentially, I'm thumbnailing here, are the original inhabitants of the New World. And that these Israelites, Hebrews, are essentially the founders of New World society. And what happened is, upon arrival, they built civilizations. Throughout history, Mormons have believed that the Aztec and the Maya ruins are the remnants of the civilizations that were built. And these descendants of the prophet Lehi congealed into two tribes, and the tribes were named after the sons of the prophet Lehi. The Nephites were the children of the righteous son Nephi, and the Lamanites were the children of the wicked son Laman. And they bifurcated into a good tribe and an evil tribe. And the evil tribe was cursed by God. And how were they cursed by God? They were given dark skin. They were given the morphological features of the Native Americans. And in time, the fallen wicked Lamanites prevailed and killed all of the righteous Nephites down to the last man. And the last one standing was Moroni, a general in the Nephite army, who buried the plates with the record of his people in the hill for Joseph Smith to find later. So the theological hook that made Mormonism interesting in its time is that Joseph Smith answered the question, where did the Native Americans come from? Where did they come from? They're fallen Israelites who are the remnant of a once great people, and that they can be redeemed, and we can convert them. So that, I think, is an interesting facet of Mormonism about where Mormonism began. Joseph Smith was also interested in economic communalism, and he believed, when he used the Book of Mormon to found a new church, and the idea of this new church is that everybody should live communally, and so people lived in communes where they shared everything economically. And Joseph Smith's movement had appeal because it established order. It used a parish system like the old churches did before the Revolutionary War. So you had the order of established parishes and leadership hierarchies, but it was also populist in a way because Joseph Smith himself never went to seminary. So he was called of God like the itinerant preacher, but he recreated the structure of the old-time religion, the sort of enclosed community. And so it was an interesting compromise that was appealing at the time. So people think about, the appeal of Mormonism today is not the same as the appeal of Mormonism back in its day. So these people lived collectively, and they started a commune in Ohio, in a place called Kirtland, Ohio. And this is where Joseph Smith started to get into trouble. I mean, he was already in trouble for his money digging activities. He was taken to court in New York over his claims that he could find buried treasure in the earth. And in Kirtland, he got in different trouble, which is big trouble. This was before the days of ATMs. This is before the days of credit card. And so if you wanted to buy stuff, you had to have paper money. We're in Ohio now, near where the commune is living, near where Cleveland is today. And you got to buy stuff with paper money. But the money has to come from Washington, and it has to be printed in Washington. And so there was a shortage of hard cash. People didn't have currency. So Joseph Smith set up a sort of bank where he said, well, I have the IOUs. I have these dollars in IOUs, even if I don't have the hard currency. But what I'll do is I'll print banknotes here that correspond one-to-one with dollars that are coming from Washington, D.C. So you can spend the banknotes that we print. And then when the money comes from Washington, you can redeem them and get your money back. And so the idea is that we're just going to have a proxy currency until we have banknotes from Washington. And you can, how many of you can guess what happened? The temptation to print more banknotes than you had dollars coming in was just too much for them. And the idea is, well, we're going to grow, we're going to make profit, we're going to grow money, it just ended up being a pyramid scheme. We can pay people back as they want to redeem their specie for the time being. And so what ended up happening is they printed many more banknotes than they could redeem with dollars, and there was a run on the bank, and the bank failed, and people were pissed. To avoid prosecution, Joseph Smith left Ohio. They had built a temple and buildings in Ohio. They left Ohio and moved across state lines to Missouri. And the difference between the United States now and the United States then is now they don't have any sort of interstate compact. I mean, states were much more sovereign than they are today. The federal government was dramatically weaker, and you could, get away from trouble if you would just, leave town. And so they started afresh in Missouri. They had problems in Missouri. They were abolitionists, and Missouri was a slave state. And one of the interesting things that the Mormons did was they voted as a block. Everybody voted the same way. And so what would end up happening is they would shop for politicians. They'd say, okay, we have all these votes, and we'll give them to whoever makes us the best deal. And they weren't large in absolute numbers, but they had enough numbers that they would swing an election. And so what ended up happening is they would just invite the politicians in and say, okay, we're, whoever greases us the best gets the votes. Well, this made people mad, very mad. And they started to have problems with their neighbors. There were armed skirmishes. There were all kinds of conflicts. There were legal problems again. And so to avoid these legal problems, the Mormons crossed the Mississippi River into Illinois. And they founded a settlement in Illinois called Nauvoo. Have any of you heard of Nauvoo? So now you've gone from New York, where the church was founded, to Ohio, where there was a banking scandal, to Missouri, where there were other conflicts with neighbors, and now we're in Illinois. And if you think the banking scandal was bad, listen to what happens in Illinois. Rumors begin to swirl that there's hanky-panky going on. Joseph Smith's wife, Emma, his long-term wife that he had been married to ever since he was in his early 20s, begins to find out that he is, there are rumors of sexual relations with other women and girls in the city of Nauvoo. And what ends up happening is the historical record is pretty clear that Joseph Smith had been telling women that, God wants me as a test, God wants you to, be my spiritual wife. And this is where Mormon polygamy comes from. If anybody knows anything about Mormon history, it's polygamy. So lots of historians debate the origins of polygamy. My personal take on the origins of polygamy is that Mormon polygamy began as the institutionalization of Joseph Smith's philandering. There is a lot of history of charismatic leaders wanting sexual access to their flock. David Koresh, as an example, Warren Jeffs, and current Mormon polygamy. So this started going on. And one of the ways that Joseph Smith, I think, was able to prolong it, one of the ways that he got away with it, is he invited members of his inner circle to engage in it as well. And, there are lots of evidence, lots of firsthand accounts of Joseph Smith's polygamy. And this caused, as you can imagine, this caused problems as well. And there were a group of dissenters who were going to expose Joseph Smith, and they printed a newspaper called the Nauvoo Expositor, and in this newspaper they published the testimony of people who were saying, you know, this is going on in Nauvoo. This idea of polygamy is going on in Nauvoo, and these rumors had been denied. And so what happened was Joseph Smith assembled a group of men, and they destroyed the printing press that the Nauvoo Expositor was printed on. They burned down they scattered the type, they destroyed the press. Well, you know, the First Amendment is a big deal, even in the 1840s, and warrants were issued for his arrest. And what ended up happening is Joseph Smith ended up in jail, and while he was in jail, a mob rushed the jail, and he was murdered. People were not interested in the wheels of justice, and so he was a victim of mob vigilante. His brother was killed with him. So now you have a leadership crisis in the church. Joseph Smith was the only leader they had ever had. You have legal problems in Nauvoo that are not going to fix themselves. And so the guy that rises to the fore, that assumes control of the church, is Brigham Young. You all know who Brigham Young is. And Brigham Young leads the Mormons to Utah. And when they're in complete isolation, they are able to do whatever they want to do. They unveil their distinctive theology. One of the things about Mormon theology, for instance, is the idea that God is a being of flesh and bone, that God is a man like we are, and that his son Jesus is a man like we are. So there is no idea of the doctrine of the Trinity. God the Father and Jesus Christ are separate and distinct beings, and they're corporeal beings, embodied beings. And so that theology was taught openly in Utah. The practice of polygamy was taught openly. There's not much anybody can do about it. So they unveiled polygamy for the first time and practiced it in the open. And this proceeded for quite a while. The nation was embroiled in the Civil War. All while, the nation turned its attention to the Civil War. Washington was not interested in what was going on in some far-flung territory. But after the Civil War ended, then their attention turned to the Mormons and Mormon polygamy. And eventually the power of the federal courts were used to bring the Mormons to heel and to force them to end the practice of polygamy. And most people would say that is the beginning of the modern era of Mormonism, the end of polygamy. The end of polygamy was essentially the end of Mormon theocracy, and this didn't sit well with some members of the faith. And so there were many fundamentalist movements that emerged that still exist today. When I go to visit my brother in St. George, Utah, in the southwest corner of Utah, anytime you go to Costco on the weekends, these members of these polygamous groups are there shopping. They buy in bulk and then take it back to their compounds. So you have the end of polygamy and assimilation for the main church headquartered in Salt Lake City, but you have other fundamentalist groups that don't abandon polygamy, that still practice polygamy to this day. And when the church abandoned polygamy, Utah was allowed to become a state. And that's where you have the sort of modern Americanized, and they sort of got over their past by saying, okay, now we're going to be uber American. We were rebels before, but now we're going to assimilate into the mainstream. And that's where you have the sort of model minority, Mitt Romney, like Boy Scout goody two-shoes. So modern Utah is still dominated by the Mormons. The state legislature is still around 90% Mormon. Mormons have a lot of power in the community, and they have a lot of power politically. They can generally get the legislation they want. They can generally do the things that they want socially. And it's an interesting place to live. I don't know if any of you remember that movie or the television show, The Twilight Zone. One thing about The Twilight Zone is that, some guy's car breaks down in some town somewhere, and at first glance, the town seems like any other town, and then you realize, oh, things are not quite normal here. That's what Utah's like. Salt Lake City looks like any other city, but underneath the surface, there's still a lot going on. So, one of the things that you see is that Mormons tend to be born in the faith, and they have a lot of extended family in the faith. And so the church solidarity and family solidarity are the same things. One of the hardest things about leaving the church for me was what my mom was going to think. I'm going to make my mom cry when I leave the church. There's also a lot of, when you have one church that's the vast majority, you have the conflation of church and community norms where religious precepts, religious doctrines become sort of public rules. And so, drinking coffee is a sin for Mormons. And so what ends up happening is that if I'm a Mormon and I want to drink coffee, I definitely don't want anybody, me too, I definitely don't want anybody in my congregation seeing me, but I also don't want anyone in my family seeing me, and I don't want anyone at work seeing me. And so when I put coffee in a shopping cart, if I'm a Utah Mormon, I am worried about virtually anyone I know seeing me, because being seen as a bad Mormon is in many respects being seen as a bad person. So there's all kinds of social control there that causes people to behave beyond their sort of subjective religiosity. Some people are motivated to behave religiously because of their beliefs, but in Utah you have people who are motivated to behave because there are consequences for misbehavior beyond the ecclesiastical sphere. Does that make sense? So you have a religious subculture there that doesn't really exist anywhere else. It's a problem for non-Mormons who live there, particularly in the schools. So, non-Mormon kids might have problems making friends. So, for instance, you could have a situation where my friend's parents don't let him or her come over to our house because we have a liquor cabinet. Or I can't get a date to the prom because Mormons aren't allowed to have any kind of courtship or dating outside the faith. So you really have a sort of closed off society. Now things are changing there. And as they change, the power of this religious subculture is starting to erode away. You also have a waxing federalism where the power of the federal government that has increased relative to states are making the Mormons change. One of the most, the decision on gay marriage upended Utah society in very profound ways, because the church had always said, we don't discriminate against homosexuals. We're not against gay people. What we're saying is that there is no sexual expression outside of legal marriage that isn't a sin. Therefore, we have one standard of morality. Heterosexuals that aren't married can't engage in sexual activity, and two people of the same sex that aren't married can't engage in sexual activity, and it's incidental that homosexuals can't get married. See what I'm saying? That was there. So we don't discriminate. And then when gay people were allowed to be married, oops, I guess we do discriminate. Sorry about that. And this has caused a lot of problems. And there is a generational shift going on. I'm sure you're all aware that there's a general sort of secularizing trend in society where people are abandoning religion at greater and greater numbers, particularly among the young. That's happening in Utah as well. So at this time, I have some, my friend Ryan wants me to say about my dad mowing. That's a good, so one of the things my dad used to always say, as a good Mormon who was not a really strong believer, in our neighborhood, the congregations in the neighborhood are pretty much coterminous. Your neighbors are also the people in your congregation, because Mormonism has a parish system, and you can't transact any commerce on Sunday. You can't work on Sunday. And so what my dad used to always say is, I don't know what's the bigger sin, doing yard work on Sunday or not doing yard work on Sunday, only because I don't want my neighbors to see. And I think that really sort of encapsulated what Mormonism is like. Mormon theology is different than Christian theology. Mormons believe in a premortal existence, that you lived in a pre-earth life, that you, as an individual, you were a spirit in a pre-earth life where you lived with God. And there was a plan there for humans to come down to earth and have bodies that were like God's bodies. And so the plan was that humans would come down to earth and go through a sort of trial of mortality to see if they could be obedient and then return to be with God in heaven. And two plans were sort of set forth. Satan's plan was, one of God's angels said, I will, send them all down to earth. I'll make sure they all come back to heaven because I'm going to force them to behave righteously. I'll make sure nobody makes any mistakes. I'll bring them all back. The other angel said, no, I have a different plan. We will give them freedom and let them do what they want, and we'll see who comes back. We'll let them choose for themselves. So these were the two plans to redeem the spirits in heaven, to allow them to get bodies and be like God. The one plan was put forth by the premortal Jesus, and the other was put forth by Lucifer, the premortal Satan. And when people went with Jesus's plan, there was a war in heaven. War in heaven before the world began, and the devil and his angels were thrown out. And that's where Satan comes from. They were all sort of angels up there, and we were sort of premortal angels as well. So then when we follow this plan, we go through a veil that wipes our memory clean so that we can't remember our pre-earth life. And this is where we are on the journey to salvation. And there is no salvation outside of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And the reason why they're so concerned about their missionary activity is because everybody needs to have the doctrines and ordinances of the Mormon Church in order to be saved. So the missionaries are out there. And then when you die, you'll be judged based on your obedience. And then there are different levels of heaven. For the wicked, they go to a place called the Telestial Kingdom. And the glory of the Telestial Kingdom is like a star in the sky. You see a star and it blinks and there's light there, but not much light. That's where the wicked go. Good people who lived good lives but believed the wrong things. Your Hindu neighbor, your Muslim neighbor, who is a good person, they go to the terrestrial kingdom, and this is glory like the moon. Think about a full moon, and think about the brightness of the moon compared to the brightness of a star. That's what happens to good people who aren't Mormons. And then the celestial kingdom is like the sun. Imagine the sun next to the moon. And if you go to the celestial kingdom, if you go to the top echelon of the celestial kingdom, you get to become a god. You become a god just like your Father in heaven is a god, and you get to make your own worlds just like the world that you lived on was made. So when people were saying, wow, isn't that audacious of Mitt Romney to want to be the president of the United States? That's quite a power grab. I was like, no, he's on his way to being a god. I mean, if you think the president is powerful, godhood is the destination. There is one other place where you can go, and that's the very bad place, and it's outer darkness. And that's where ultimately the devil and his angels will be cast. And then there are a few really bad people who go there too, like maybe Judas, maybe Cain. But that's the essential notion of Mormon theology, that you are on a path to salvation and that the church is the vehicle of salvation. So I was told to talk for about 45 minutes, so I think I'm going to stop at this juncture. And is that right? And so I'll stop at this juncture, and then if any of you have questions or comments, or if any of you need some clarification from the presentation, I'll be happy to entertain any questions any of you might have. Or you can type them in the box.
I thought I'd like to make a comment. I actually lived in Salt Lake City myself, went from 1972 to 1974 when I was a child, from about 9 to 12 years old. And of course, many of my classmates were Mormon. Of course, then they taught the history of Mormonism in Utah. And at that time, I didn't really think much about it. And what's funny is that the elementary school I attended is where I first checked out a lot of books on nature, including Darwin and Origins of Species. And I was also reading a lot of mythology. And to me, at the time, Christianity was sticking more and more to me. And I was brought up, mainly mainstream Christian. Because my parents were moderately Christian, but we didn't go to church regularly. But to me, it's thinking more and more like mythology. And I didn't really think about Mormonism too much until years later, and thinking about it. And also, I've had a little bit of experience with Scientology. And to me, there's not much difference between Joseph Smith and L. Ron Hubbard.
No.
And I can't help but thinking they're both con men who maybe, I don't know how much they really believe what they're spouting. But it just, they're really strong comparisons between them.
So there's a lot to unpack there. The first thing I'll say is that, yes, they teach Mormon history in Utah schools because Mormon history is Utah history. And if you teach Utah history, you teach Mormon history because those two are the same thing. And so it's really interesting how that takes place. With respect to Joseph Smith and L. Ron Hubbard, I think in the sociology of religion, there's a general formula that charismatic leaders follow. There was a sociologist by the name of Max Weber who outlined the nature of these charismatic leaders, and many of them share some of the same characteristics. The question of what they actually believed is an interesting question. There are many historians who grapple with the idea of what did Joseph Smith actually believe, and one of the leading theories of Joseph Smith is advanced by a guy named Dan Vogel, who argues that Joseph Smith was, and this is his term, a pious fraud. That Joseph believed he was in contact with God, and Joseph believed he was establishing the church, but that people wouldn't necessarily believe him if he told them that, and so he had to concoct some other mechanisms to help them believe. So the idea of gold plates in the Book of Mormon, that was kind of the fraud part, but it was done in the service of the pious part. Does that make sense? You know, sort of how you might lie to your kids about Santa Claus or something. You know, the fraud part was a mechanism that allowed him to do what he actually believed, which was restore the Church of Jesus Christ. Did he actually believe that God wanted him to have sex with those women?
Now, from what I've read, his first wife was unhappy when she found out about it, and his son.
That's the understatement of, yeah, that's a bit of an understatement. His first wife threw the maid down the steps. She was not happy. It should have thrown him down the steps, but you know, it was a different time. Let me get to a couple of these questions that I'm getting on the chat. Did I have any success as a missionary converting anyone? Yeah, I was good at it. I did have success. Would you say that the Mormon Church has the same level of control as other groups like the Jehovah's Witnesses or Scientology? One of the interesting things about Mormonism is it has community-based social control. That you have this sort of, there's no place where Jehovah's Witnesses have a majority. There's no place where Scientologists have the majority. And so Jehovah's Witnesses say that if you're an apostate, you have to shun apostates. So if I am a parent and my child is a Jehovah's Witness and they leave the faith, I'm supposed to disown that child. Mormonism has never had to have those kinds of draconian rules because the whole society chips in to keep people there. If status in the church is tantamount to status in the community, then the whole community keeps you in line. If what is a sin is essentially seen as a crime, even if the police aren't going to arrest you, then you're constrained from doing those kinds of things. So Mormons have never really had to have the idea of shunning their apostate kids. Now that's starting to change as the community loses some of its power and some of the power starts to dilute. When there were, about 1990, a lot of non-LDS people started moving into Utah and Mormon majorities began to decrease. And when that happened, you start to have people who say, I don't know what your deal is with coffee, but I really like coffee. And they start to not care. You get a critical mass that are saying, well, we're just not Mormon and we don't care. But what that means is that if I'm a Mormon and I want to try coffee, I have my non-Mormon friends at work, or I have my non-Mormon associates that make that comfortable. And so coffee changes from something that's sort of morally wrong, objectively, to just something that we don't do. And that has less power to control people's, it's not a sin generally, it's just a sin for us. And that is a problem. So I would say no, the church doesn't mandate the same kind of control that Jehovah's Witnesses or Scientology has, because they outsource that control to the community. But if that community starts to wane, then maybe they'll adopt some of those kinds of things. What is my take on the CES letter? The CES letter is a document that outlines problems with Mormonism that's been circulated around. Most of the things in the CES letter have been around for a long, long time. I find that most Mormons who leave the church do so because they have political problems with the church. I don't know how much anti-Mormon arguments. Right? Where's the largest population of Mormons outside the U.S.? Well, in terms of raw numbers, that's Mexico. Mexico has more church members than most other places. But in terms of percentage of the population, it's the Pacific Islands, Samoa and Tonga, where some of the Samoans and some of the Tongans, some of the islands have are like 1/3 Mormon. Ryan can connect me, like 1/3, right? And so they're
highest
more.
Estimate is 60%, but I don't think that's accurate. The
No, I don't
census
think
data,
that's accurate.
Census data doesn't agree with that at all.
And that's a Samoa or Tonga?
Tonga is 60%, but
Yeah.
the census data put it closer to 30.
1/3, right? Yeah. So one of the things here is that in the, I talked about the Lamanites and the Nephites in the New World. Among the Lamanites and the Nephites, there was a character named Hagoth, the builder of ships, and he sailed off the coast, and he is the one that founded the Pacific Islands. And so when the missionaries went to Tonga and Samoa, the missionaries said, look, here's a book about your history. You are the descendants of Hagoth, the builder of ships. I have a friend that used to teach at the Brigham Young University in Hawaii who said that he had students that could trace their genealogy all the way back to Hagoth. So you have a unique missionary moment where you can go to these islands and say, look, you're the, you are of Israelite blood, you're God's chosen people. And that's why missionary efforts in Tonga and Samoa were so successful. Can I touch on the magical underwear? Myth? True? True. When you are on your way to salvation, you have to go through certain rituals, and these are called the endowments, and they take place in temples. And temples are buildings that are set aside for this purpose. Only Mormons that are recommended by their ecclesiastical leaders can go in. And when you first go through the temple for the first time, you are given the magical underwear, or the temple garments. Magical underwear is quite pejorative. My mom would not be pleased with me saying magical underwear. The temple garments used to go from wrist to ankle. And so you can imagine people working in the desert sun in Utah, in southern Utah, 100-degree heat, in temple garments that go under your clothes that go from wrist to ankle. They were then shortened to the leg part comes just above the knee, and the top part fits you like a t-shirt. But for a long while, they were one piece. They were a jumpsuit. And then, a major advance was going to the two-piece garments. So the garments have evolved, but they're still there. One of the things about the garments is they remind you of the covenants that you make in the temple. And one of the covenants is a covenant for chastity, sexual fidelity. And so I imagine if you're a Mormon man or a Mormon woman and you're about to cheat on your spouse and you're taking off your clothes, you're going to take off your garments too. So these garments are a fairly strong deterrent. Taking off the garments is a big deal. Taking off the garments, for me, that's the Rubicon. When I took off my garments, that was the, I took them off. I took the bottoms off first, but I still wore the shirt because people can see whether or not you're wearing your garments on top. So I sort of wore half garments for a while. I have a friend who left the church but worked in an environment that was so religious that he bought boxer briefs and t-shirts that would make it look like he was continuing to wear his garments so that he wouldn't endure the social stigma of not wearing garments. So the garments are a big deal. The garments, of course, preclude a lot of mainstream fashion, clothes that you would consider to be normal. For instance, women can't wear anything sleeveless. Shorts are going to be sort of Bermuda length. So the garments do a good job of sort of marking identity. How did my family react when I left the faith? It was not good. Have they accepted, or do they try to reconvert you? When you leave the only true church, that's a problem for your parents. When I went away to Rutgers, one of the deals that I made was that I would try one more time, that I would, I would leave the environment that I was in, all the associates that I had that had, invaded my mind, and I would give it one more try, that I would start in a new ward, I would start in going to church, in the New York City area, and I would try again. But, it just didn't It just didn't work. So they did try to reconvert me. But one of the things that happened was they would try to argue with me about religion. But once you become a religion professor, they don't argue with you that much because they're going to lose the arguments. And so, I think I've had a profound effect on my family because my life didn't fall apart. I didn't, from my mom always taught me that there are two kinds of people in the world: people who abstain from alcohol and alcoholics, and that's it. And the first sip of beer you have is the first step on the escalator that ends you, laying in a gutter in a pool of your own urine with a bottle of cheap wine by your head. And that didn't happen. And I'm happily married to a Catholic girl, and we have two beautiful children. And so that has had a profound effect on my family. And now none of my siblings are in the church. Because the idea is that there's only, there is no happiness outside of the gospel. There is. And so everybody has come to peace with it in my extended family, except my mom, who still thinks this is a phase. Let's see. Did my mom cry? My mom still cries. Could a Mormon possibly be president or in a major political position without Mormonism skewing their political judgment? Ryan and I wrote a book on that. And I don't know if we agree on that, but I think, I am, I'm not much of a Republican myself, but as Republicans go, Mitt Romney has proven himself to be a fairly reasonable one. And so at the time in 2012, when I was asked this by many reporters, I argued that he would probably be, I don't think he would take marching orders from Salt Lake City, and I don't think Salt Lake City would give marching orders. I think the church tries to stay out of electoral politics, except on certain issues. The gay marriage issue was existential for them, and so they were involved in that. The church is really more moderate than many evangelical religions on a number of topics. They really don't, they're opposed to abortion, but they're not really involved in pro-life legislation, and they're not attacking Roe v. Wade. They're fairly moderate on that. They don't equate abortion with murder in their official doctrine. On evolution and science in the classroom, they take no position. You can be an active believing Latter-day Saint and completely believe in the Darwinian evolution, not a problem at all. So in many respects, they're much more moderate than evangelicals. They just have they have a lot of sex hangups, and they always have. Can you discuss the failed effort to found the state of Deseret, which would have been much larger than Utah? When the Mormons entered the Salt Lake Valley, that was virgin territory. It ostensibly belonged to Mexico, but it was ungoverned. And the Mormons originally wanted a huge territory that they called Deseret that extended all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Los Angeles would have been in the state of Deseret. It covered the whole of Nevada. They got there in 1847, and sadly for them, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo happened in 1848, and so they were back under the auspices of the United States. And once they were a territory of the United States, they were under federal control. And so very shortly after they started setting up their theocracy, there were federal judges, and there was nearly a war between the Mormons and the United States in 1857, where Brigham Young was removed as territorial governor and a federal appointee was there. So Mormon attempts at theocracy generally failed. So the next two questions are Native Americans welcome in the Mormon Church? And the next one is, what about race? Okay. I mentioned earlier that Native Americans were cursed by God, and that the mark of this curse was dark skin, or the morphological features of being a Native American. Those marks Native Americans can join the church in full faith and fellowship, and some of the earliest missionary efforts were to redeem the Native Americans. And the idea was that when they would be redeemed, they would then lose the curse and become Lamanites. And so there was a Mormon prophet by the name of Spencer W. Kimball, who was the prophet in the 1970s, who believed that when Native Americans converted to Mormonism, they would turn white. And the church had an Indian placement program where they took children off the reservations and put them into homes of white Mormons with the idea of converting them to Mormonism so that they could be white. And that was part of the, and Spencer W. Kimball said that I have compared the children in the Indian placement program with their siblings that still live on the reservation. You can clearly see that these kids are quite a bit lighter than their siblings. I had a friend that was a Native American kid that was in this Indian placement program. But Native Americans aren't the only ones that are cursed. People of African descent are also cursed. And the idea is that, remember, I talked to you about this war in heaven and people who followed Jesus and people who followed Satan. In that war, there were some people who didn't pick a side. In that war, there were some fence sitters. And those people sort of waited to see how it would wash out. And they ultimately came to the right side, but only after they sort of saw that Jesus's victory was a fait accompli. And so these fence sitters who were less valiant in the pre-existence were punished. And how they were punished is that they were born through the lineage of the first murderer, Cain. Remember, Cain in the book of Genesis slew his brother Abel. And so the descendants of Cain were cursed. And how do you know they're cursed? They're cursed with, the mark of the curse is black skin. So people of African descent are the cursed descendants of the first murderer, Cain, and they were unable to hold the priesthood. So they were unable to participate in the church in full faith and fellowship. And that doctrine persisted until 1978. And that is the time where the church allowed people of African descent to participate in full faith and fellowship. And I remember where I was that day. I was in seminary class. I guess I would have been in the 10th grade. And I remember the seminary teacher coming in and saying, you know, the world has changed. And they have, you know, and it was a profound moment, the idea that black people could be ordained to the priesthood and join the church in full faith and fellowship. Now, to their credit, I think the Mormons have worked hard, particularly the leadership, have worked hard to expunge racism from their institution. And the church is not racist now. Utah is probably, with respect to its attitudes towards immigration, Utah is probably one of the most immigrant-friendly states in the union. And, you know, the governor there, who is a Republican, has been very clear that he does not tolerate xenophobia. So they've gone 180 degrees from an institutionalized racist policy to very conscious efforts to expunge institutional. Let's see. I disagree. They stay out of politics. I worked in television news in Salt Lake for almost 5. So what I would say is they're very involved in state politics. That's true. But they stay out of electoral politics. They don't endorse candidates. But they definitely are involved in state politics. So, for instance, they're very concerned about liquor laws. Utah has always had arcane liquor laws, and the church never wants to expand them. One of the things that the church did in 1983 was they sort of lobbied the legislature to pass a law prohibiting HBO, prescription television station. They didn't want you to have subscriber TV in your home because HBO can show boobs, and that would be the end of Western civilization. So the idea is that we're going to prohibit these things from coming into the home. And this was struck down by the Supreme Court. It was called the Cable Indecency Act, and it was struck down by the Supreme Court. And the reason why this was such a threat is because, you know, no one wants to be seen leaving the theater after going to a movie that's R-rated. But what if it's piped into your home? Then no one can see you watch these illicit films. So yes, I agree. There is no doubt that the church is involved in Utah politics. They essentially, you know, in many ways, they pull the levers with respect to Utah politics. So I was talking about in national politics and electoral politics. They're generally not involved. The Gay Mormon camp and the ERA are really the only two examples I can think of extensive involvement in national politics. How would they explain people who have how would they explain people who have light skin but aren't white like Asians? They don't have a fully developed theology of race. The only two races that they have theorized about are Native Americans and people of African dissent. You know how open Brigham Young University is to scholarship that scientifically discredits Mormon theology and the pseudo-history of Mormon, Joseph Smith? Things have, first of all, you can't take a position contrary to church teachings at Brigham Young University. So I am a sociologist, and I could not advocate for marriage equality on that campus and keep my job. The talk that I just gave you, I will stand by in terms of being factually correct, and I will stand by my interpretation of the history of Mormonism. I will stand by my theory that polygamy began as the institutionalization of Joseph Smith's philandering. Totally stand by that. Completely defensible. Couldn't say that at BYU. No. The day I said that would be my last day on the job. However, they have opened up a lot. They have conceded a lot. So for instance, when I was 20 years old, the idea that Joseph Smith was involved in this sort of money digging, treasure digging, was an anti-Mormon lie. Now the evidence is incontrovertible, and it's accepted even by scholars at BYU. And they argue that his adventures in money digging were a sort of precursor, God preparing him for the Book of Mormon. So slowly but surely, Mormon historians are grappling or coming to grips with their history. But it will be a long time before any historian could stand up in front of the class and recount Latter-day Saint history from the standpoint of secular history. Do I know Wade Clark Roof? Yes. I know. I was sad to hear that he passed. And everybody who is involved in the sociology of religion knew Clark. Ryan, did you ever meet Roof?
I don't know that I ever met him, but I've read plenty of his work.
Yeah. If you haven't, any sociologist of religion of our generation that didn't know him personally knows his work. Can I say anything about the Salamander Letter? For a long time, the church attempted to keep the lid on its history. Things about money digging that I told you, things about different versions of the first vision, these things were suppressed. There were many things in church archives that were not available. And people would say, you know, I know this is in the archives, but I don't have access to it. So the church was keeping a lid on its history for obvious reasons. When I was a kid, people didn't even talk about Joseph Smith practicing polygamy. That was a Brigham Young thing. And so what ended up happening is a very creative guy by the name of Mark Hoffman thought that if he could forge documents that painted Mormon history in a bad light, the church would buy these documents to suppress them. And so he went to libraries and found cover pages in books, paper from the 1820s, and experimented with ink and came up with documents that were forgeries that paralleled what people had known about Mormon history. For instance, money digging. And one of the letters that he wrote connected the idea of money digging explicitly with the Book of Mormon that was said to be written in Joseph Smith's hand. And this was what was called the Salamander Letter. The idea that it wasn't the angel of Moroni that saw him, it was a fiery spirit. And the church bought this letter from Mark Hoffman at great expense and then promptly suppressed it. And the interesting thing, and this was one of the keys that caused me to stop my belief in the church, because there was a famous picture in the Salt Lake Tribune of all of the church leaders standing around this document with the forger, Mark Hoffman, talking about what a great historical find it is and how we can't wait to buy this thing to put it in the vault where no one will see it. And it was an anti-Mormon scholar by the name of Gerald Tanner who was the one who didn't believe it and who outed this as a forgery. So I was like, wow. It was an enemy of the church who had everything to gain from this letter being true, who discovered that it was fake. And it was the prophets and the apostles who are supposedly listening to the Spirit who were fooled. And that really had a profound effect on me. When Hoffman was about to be outed as a forger, he made bombs to blow up the people that were going to out him. And he is now in the Utah State Prison with a guy named Dan Lafferty, who was a polygamist who murdered someone. I'm sure there's interesting conversations in that cell. I don't know if Lafferty and Hoffman are still cellmates, but I know they were. What are the 116 missing pages of the Book of Mormon? Joseph Smith began the translation of the gold plates, and he had a wealthy farmer named Martin Harris who financed this translation. And Harris's wife, Lucy, was not happy that Harris was funding this project. And so Harris went to Joseph Smith and said, I need proof. You got to give me proof. She's not going to let me pay for this project unless I have proof. Let me take the manuscript to show her. And Joseph Smith had written 116 pages, and he gave the manuscript to Martin Harris, who took them to show his wife, and then the manuscript came up missing. And Martin Harris returned to Joseph Smith and said, the manuscript is missing. And Joseph Smith was distraught. But what he said was, and so Martin Harris says, well, I'll still support you. I guess you'll just have to translate that part over again. And what Joseph Smith said was, well, I can't translate that part over again, because what if the people who have the 116 pages alter the 116 pages so they're different from what I translate over again? So I can't do that. But the Lord has told me that there's another part of the record here that covers the same stuff from a different writer, and I'll translate that instead, and we'll cover the ground that was covered by the 116 pages. You know, the further away you get from this stuff, just the more incredulous you are. And that's where the 116 pages come. Well, I hope there's nobody here. I hope the Angel Moroni is actually not a spy for the church. Any other questions?
Any other questions? Well, Rick, that was very interesting.
I have thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you.
And the ties with U.S. history and what we see today, I'm very glad you were able to join us.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.